It is May 18th. This is the PFF Forecast. It is a lovely Monday afternoon here on the East Coast, about 1:30 Eastern time. You're back in lovely Cincinnati, Ohio, after your little, rest and relaxation trip, your recovery trip to Wisconsin. We're going to do some good stuff here. We've got Last Dance obviously finished. We'll talk a little bit about that, a little football spin on it. There's a little bit of league news, largely facilities reopening, which we'll touch on. 1988 Red Zone, which you wanted to talk about, which is great. We'll do a little surprise playoff contenders. We've got an analytics kind of discussion topic and normalization, and then a cool and interesting question about who the most valuable defensive player is in the NFL. So with that being said, let's rock. You're back.
Yeah, I took a little trip, did some work, but mostly, facilitated.
Shave.
No, that's true. I think I'll get there someday. I got to finish this Josh Allen article, and then I can walk over to the store and get a razor here.
Not in Buffalo, you can't.
What's that?
Tease it. I said not in Buffalo, you can't.
Yeah, right.
Tease it a little bit for me. What are you writing about for Josh Allen?
So people are talking about, how Josh Allen's deep passing isn't a concern because it's only a certain fraction of his passes.
Mm-hmm.
And I just my whole thing is just sort of, we talked about the Last Dance. It's like, in a league where deep passing is superior, in terms of efficiency and, just the further downfield you go, the more efficient it is, even after you account for turnovers and stuff like that. Not being able to go downfield is bad, even if you are improving underneath. It's sort of like if you were an NBA player and you were getting really good at mid-range jumpers, that's certainly not a bad thing. But if you are a player that can only shoot mid-range jumpers, I don't think you're as valuable. And I think so,
it's the absence of opportunity that is afforded by the skill. Which is interesting. Let's save that. I have some thoughts on that. Yeah, and I'm going to try and poke some holes in your argument in a second, because I was thinking about this too. But the Last Dance last night, the last 4 episodes I thought were by far the best of the whole thing. And there are a couple things that really stuck out to me from last night's. And the first one was something that I didn't know that they were going to talk about, because there were a few things that seemed like they just weren't going to make the story, one of which was actually Jordan's family, which interestingly crops up randomly for the first time in the last episode. His kids are on there, but that's the first time anything, which is interesting because in Space Jam, his kids are in that movie. And so it was a very interesting thing that they totally, that was, out of the dock, and obviously Jordan had final cut on all of it. But the second thing that I wasn't sure they were going to talk about that they did was the Steve Kerr thing. And this hits really close to home for me. His dad was not, my dad is still alive, thank God, but my dad went to American University of Beirut and was actually graduated from there 1 or 2 years right before Kerr's dad went over there, and was assassinated in Beirut shortly after becoming the vice president of AUB. And it was crazy. It shined a light on things that are still way bigger than sports, that are going on still to this day, that are just terrible and horrible. And the fact that they were able to spend 10 minutes on it, I thought was awesome. I asked my dad about it. I was like, hey, what was the motivating factor behind these things? And he goes, as crazy as this sounds, and people want to make it a big political thing, oftentimes it was just because there were certain factions that wanted to corrupt the admissions system. And if you couldn't bribe someone into the school, you were going to pay for it with your life. And that was crazy to me, but I thought it was great that they had that story in there.
Yeah, it's right. Yeah, it was something that I knew about Kerr. I knew that he had, and I didn't know all the details, but they went into that. It's obviously Steve Kerr is pretty outspoken. It's always those sort of personal experiences where I will, if somebody's had one like that, I kind of will take their opinions a little bit more seriously.
Seriously,
So
yeah.
It's a lot of people don't like Steve Kerr because of his opinions, but I think in some ways, like, he's got scars that I think have informed him. And in many ways, I think he's spot on. But
No, that's a great point. Like, it can't be underscored what he's been through, and the reason, what does he attribute that loss to? And it has to be political unrest and incompetency in politics. And for him to be now outspoken about it makes sense. And you can agree or disagree with him, but like, you got to give him credit for sticking up for something. It's way easier, I think, for him to be quiet than it is for him to be outspoken. And that's something that, for him to be outspoken and not be like a lunatic on it is tough to do. So kudos to him for that. What else stuck out to you about the last couple of episodes about Jordan?
I don't know. I think, like, Scottie Pippen apparently didn't like how he was portrayed. But I really think that Scottie Pippen was a star in the show. I thought he handled being one of the best while also supporting somebody who's the best. I thought he did that really well. And I think he never, he was never, he was never delusional about his situation, which I always thought was great.
It.
And it was one of those where even when he made a mistake, even when he pulled out of, because honestly, like, if you think about him, he was second fiddle to Jordan for so many years. And then he becomes, the best player on the team after Jordan retires, and they get in the playoffs, and, Jackson calls up a play for Kukoc instead of him. And, personally, I have less of a problem with, like, him initially being like, no, forget this, than maybe some other people do. Now, again, in a team sport, you sort of have to know, like, the circumstances and stuff, and ultimately you still play and you still do that. But I can understand him, like, sort of waiting it out. He had a terrible contract, obviously terrible relative to other NBA players.
Yeah, which he signed to, in fairness.
Good for somebody who who came up like he did. But there's a lot of situations where I think felt as though he was sacrificing a lot. And in a moment where he could have been somebody, he could have shined, he was not afforded the ability to. And so when you look at him, I think it's as noisy as life can be. He mostly played his role extremely well, but in one moment of weakness, he got bludgeoned for it, right?
I have a comp for you, because I thought you said it perfectly. He wasn't delusional, right? The thing about Pippen was, anyone that's as good as Scottie Pippen in today's NBA is by and large like, you know what? I need to go do this myself. Like, I need to be player 1A on a team and see if I can take him to a championship. And he understood that Michael Jordan was the quarterback, right? Like, nothing went without Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
And I would compare him maybe to a guy like Larry Fitzgerald, who has such a great care for how the team does. Now, the problem for Larry Fitzgerald is he never had Michael Jordan, right? But Scottie Pippen did an excellent job of understanding that. And I mean, he was great when Jordan went and played baseball, but it wasn't like he all of a sudden, like, his points per game didn't jump to like 29. Like, he was still in like the 21, 22 range. So
I think even in the modern NBA, although he's retired now, I think Chris Bosh is probably that type of player, in that, he was a star, but sort of understood his limitations as being a number one player. And then, when Dwayne Wade and LeBron joined the Heat, he was still very, very good. But ultimately was more of a supporting player in that stardom. And there's room for that. And then, certain people don't, like, that's how, things get territorial and things like that. They don't realize that there's room for that. That's why, James Harden, goes to Houston and he's doing great. Right. But, it's sort of like you break up, some of the greatness that was the Thunder and all that kind of stuff. So, but with somebody who can sort of incorporate greatness around them, and not be, sort of overly sensitive. I think it's impossible, which we saw with Pippen. But if you do it well enough, which I think he did, you can really do great things. The other thing that was really interesting was when it was their last win, when they were doing the, when they were doing the parade and everything, and Pippen called it the last dance. I thought it was funny that a certain number of them, they heard the news that it was Phil Jackson's last season, and they all came to grips with it in their own different ways. And it seemed like Pippen was just like kind of relieved not to be underneath Michael, and relieved not to have to
to make some money.
Well, to make some money, yes, and ultimately, like at that point, you're a Hall of Fame NBA player, you're a top whatever player in the history of the league. You've won 6 rings. There's not a whole lot more for you to do other than go get yours. And he seemed sort of relieved when it was time. Whereas other people, I think, were a little bit more disappointed. As you saw, Michael was disappointed. I don't think Phil Jackson ever gets disappointed in things he can't control. But it was an interesting contrast to see those two and how they reacted differently to it being the last dance.
I am trying to think of what it would be like. The closest thing I can come to is, let's say a couple years ago, I don't know, right after maybe the Patriots beat the Falcons or something, Robert Kraft was like, you know what, just like Bill and I can't get along. Like as great as this whole winning thing is, I think we're just going to have to tear this whole thing down and rebuild. That was the closest I think I can, in today's NFL, liken what Jerry Reinsdorf and Jerry Krause did, because MJ was still at his peak. And that's why I was trying to compare Brady and Jordan. And I think they're the closest. And the reason I keep saying I think they're the closest, a couple of reasons. I'm curious your thoughts here. The first is, I think Jordan is about as close to a singular existence as we'll get. Like, he has been the most copied athlete since, but he wasn't copying anyone. He was so original, and every choice he made in his originality made him cooler. Just like astounding, because most of us, we make one decision after another that just makes us look dumber and dumber, and no one wants to copy us. He just continued. His hit rate was 100%. But he also had these multiple peaks of greatness. And now his were more athletically oriented. Brady has had this last run that he's had, and last year notwithstanding, has been very similar to me to what Michael Jordan did in those last 3 years in Chicago, and why I wish it had continued. He was winning not just with skill, but also with mental brilliance. And that is the comparison to the two that I think gets closest. Is I think Brady's doing it in about as singular a way as a quarterback has, but also has these different peaks that Jordan also had. And to me, that's why they're the closest. And it's very interesting to see, as this Last Dance documentary comes out, Brady transitioning now to a new team where actually his chances got better at winning. Brady made the choice to leave to have a better chance of winning a Super Bowl, I think, ultimately, whereas Jordan got screwed over by what has to be the dumbest ownership decision in sports history.
Yeah. And even the Brady comparison is stretched, because
I agree.
TB12 is an attempt to do some of the same things with Jordan. We're not as I don't mean this in a dig, because I bought Jordan shoes growing up, a lot of them, but we're not as materialistic as we used to be in the 90s and early 2000s. So Brady sort of knew he couldn't sell gear as well as Jordan could, just because the times
also
changed.
Just not as cool.
Well, sure, but we're far more like health conscious, and like Brady saw the evolution of those things and decided TB12 was going to be his brand, and it was just not. It hasn't taken off the same way that the Jumpman did, right? So
of course not.
And that's tricky. The other thing is that the hard part is going to be, I always think, Phil Jackson's a great coach, but I always think Belichick gets way more of the credit for the Brady Belichick pair than Phil Jackson got for anything the Bulls did. And
which is a shame, honestly.
Well, I mean, but ultimately he got his because he went to the Lakers and won championships, and basically proved. It'd be like Belichick if he would leave the Patriots and go back to the Browns and win like 3 or 4 championships,
or just to win more with the Patriots, right?
Or to win more, yeah, because now it's essentially a completely different team. So it's interesting. That's why I think the documentary took off. I think even if they were to make one about LeBron James, or any player in any other league, I don't think it becomes anywhere near what it is now, or what that one was, because things are so much different now, and things are so much, medias are so much different. Like they only had so many resources. They only had so many games on TV. Like we had to focus on a few stars. Whereas now, like you can watch, if you want to watch the Memphis Grizzlies every single night, you can sort of ignore every other team. And so it's more geographic.
And you hit on something, which is, I think, the reason that everything for this was perfect. Jordan was the perfect athlete. We're not going to see that point of perfection right now. The other thing is, you need documentaries to tell stories that couldn't be told before because the footage wasn't out there. But now you can literally see like all of the behind the scenes to all of this stuff all the time. It's so much easier. Players have Instagrams. Tom Brady spun up his own documentary fairly easily. Like all of these things are so much more available. The intrigue isn't there. Like I can't imagine this type of excitement about a documentary for a player right now, because you already will know so much of it. And I do think Belichick Brady gets close. That it's different enough that it doesn't make me nearly as excited. And I think that's because of the time period.
It's why I will watch games from the 80s and 90s on YouTube, but I very rarely watch a game from like 2006, because I had a ton of extra stimuli available to me at the time, in the form of everything that was available then. I forgot a lot about 1993, right? And in fact, there was a lot concealed, back then. And it's probably why, like you said, Jordan, we already know a ton about LeBron. LeBron already had a TV show to say that he was going to go to the Heat, right? Like, we've been privy to a lot of those things.
Can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
Would you rather be Michael Jordan or Tom Brady?
As a person,
you have to basically been them and live through their career.
I like football more. I mean, so if I was actually good at quarterback, I think that'd be a lot of fun. I would say Brady, partially because he can still play, and I think, I don't know, the football is just, to me, like, I don't know. It's tough. I don't know if I could thrive under the way that Michael Jordan lives his life, in terms of just always being kind of like salty about things. But Brady is somewhat that way, but a little less so. So I feel like Brady.
That's the answer I expected. Brady's life, you watch the Jordan documentary, and there's a certain amount of, I could never do that. Even if I had the physical ability, I couldn't do it. Like, there's just a uniqueness to it that I think is awe-inspiring. And there's Brady is amazing, but like also his life has some similarities to mine, and he has what appears to be a much happier relationship with his family, and like all these normal qualities that, still he's obviously very abnormal, but Jordan was like a different type of species. And I honestly came away from watching this and watching that, particularly that last season, being like, he felt so totally different. The only time that he even seemed similar to anyone was when he ordered a pizza and got food poisoning.
Yep. Yeah, that's 100%.
By the way, we'll transition to your 80s football here in a sec. Who's the visiting city that is most likely to food poison a opposing quarterback in today's NFL?
Appleton, Wisconsin.
And is it Aaron Rodgers? Or Jordan
Love? I do think when Aaron Rodgers plays for the San Francisco 49ers and he visits for, like, let's say an NFC divisional playoff game. Well, that's never going to happen because they're never going to make the playoffs to Jordan Love. But like, okay, so like week 7, San Francisco goes to Lambeau. They stay in Appleton because that's the only city that's big enough to have, hotels in that area. there's totally going to be some guy from Manitowoc that like orders, some
Oh, that's great.
some deep dish, like he's going to want Chicago style pizza, and like he's going to order deep dish, and it's going to be a little too deep. Let's just put it that way.
Okay, so that's a good one because it's a small enough city where the options are like limited. I thought that was one of the funniest things was we're in Park City and like I can't get food at 9:30 at night.
Yeah.
How ridiculous is that nowadays? So I don't know that there's any other cities that are that small where you'd have that situation. So I'm going to take it a different route. In Vegas, corruption is very possible. And even if you're staying at the nicest hotel out there, someone will have the reason to go in and try and, put a little extra something on a grilled chicken Caesar salad that's coming Tom Brady's way. So that's my thought there. I could talk about this for a long time. I rewatched a lot of the 97 and 98 games. It was great. I loved Bob Costas. Dude, Bob Costas is incredible. Comparing him to Marv Albert, who Marv Albert everyone says is, he's the GOAT, whatever. Bob Costas was so good in those 98 finals. Like I said this last night, and no one cares to read my tweets on this, obviously, but like Jordan's Game 6 performance, the second best performance that night was Bob Costas, who just threw a no-hitter in that game. He was insane.
Yeah, I also find it funny that like Dick Stockton was doing like national NBA games back then, because now, he's like the fifth guy in Fox.
What about Bill Walton
for NFL? Yeah, Walton was always like a caricature, wasn't he? Like at this point, you just like, hey, let's do some LSD and watch some basketball.
He was just giving Karl Malone in some of these games. He was saying things, and he was calling him Carl. And the funny thing about Walton is that he like had a speech impediment and like couldn't speak, and finally learns how to speak, and then you couldn't shut him up. And he's just like, "Come on, Carl, you've got to be better than that, Carl." Like going on and on. It was so funny. Carl won the MVP that year, and he was just, oh man, there's so many. I'll watch this whole thing over again to pick up on all the little pieces that I didn't the first time around. It was that good. Okay. You watched 1988 Red Zone, and I need to understand this. I need you to take me through this.
Yeah, I was a little bit. So when I saw that this happened, I was excited, but I was riding home from the Twin Cities yesterday, so I didn't watch it live. So I watched it today, and I'm like, this is outstanding. The tricky part is that the guy only had 6 1988 Week 2 games, which I think lowers the effect. But he basically
Red Zone with 6 games.
He recreated Red Zone for a random week in 1988, and it was fun and it was funny. There's a lot less scoring back then, so it was sort of like
was the impact, because like the reason it works so well today is that there's always a team that's a threat for
there
scoring.
are more turnovers back then though, so he did have like opportunities.
Okay.
To sort of
was he doing was he narrating the whole thing?
Kind of. There was a lot of dead air though that I was a little, but I guess there's dead air with Scott Hansen and Siciliano too. But I don't know, man. I thought it was a great idea, and I thought that there were a few errors that were made in like the tactical,
What was the best game from 1988?
I think it was Giants 49ers, where Montana came off the bench for Steve Young, and trying to remember what I was kind of working when I was watching this too. So, but that was the year San Fran kind of struggled. They went 10-6 and then like ran the table, won the Super Bowl. But yeah, like the Giants got out ahead, then they yanked Steve Young from Montana. Montana threw a 78-yard touchdown to Jerry Rice off the bench. It's kind of cool. I mean, it's stuff you don't see today, right? You don't see like Tom Brady coming off the bench for Blaine Gabbert, right? Like you don't see guys sitting out when they're barely hurt. Like they're just hurt enough to not start but play. It's sort of weird, but that happened like all the time back then.
Maybe we'll see that with the Saints this year.
It could be the case, right? It could be the case, especially if the Saints are like, back then the NFC was interesting because the Niners were so much better than everybody else. So like they could sit Montana for Young like a few times this season just because it's like baseball. And it's like, well, you know, we might lose this game, but we're going to go 13-3, and it's not like the Rams are going to catch us, you know, in the NFC West. So, but yeah, so when it first came, I was disappointed a little bit, but I thought the idea was great, and I thought the execution was good. I think it'd be even better if Scott Hansen did it. Let's put it that way.
There's no doubt. I was trying to think about how hard would it have been to be like, hey, Scott, like, this is what I'm doing. Would you want to be a part of this? But I'm guessing he doesn't want to take the risk of being bad, right?
Yeah, and there was it was interesting because like a lot of names were mispronounced and stuff. Like I feel like Hansen would like think that would be a risk.
Yes.
But you know, I still think I thought it was a great idea, and I thought, execution was far better than what I would have thrown out there. But maybe still lacking a little bit, and maybe there's opportunity for somebody else to do a good job with it.
Could be you. You'd be good on that, because you know enough about those old games where like random player comes in and scores a touchdown, and you're just all over it. You're naming the school he went to. His mother Jane would be so proud of him. That'd be you.
It'd be fun.
Okay, current NFL news. I want to keep tabs on where you're at. Optimistic for this coming season. Based on the team memo about facilities reopening, based on what states and governors are saying right now, where are you at?
I've always said 70-30.
You're still 70-30.
And
that's
trending,
for anything overall.
I'm trending further. So if you want to make it specific, like NFL, I think is a huge favorite to play without fans. The only thing that makes me nervous is if some of these leagues don't start pretty soon, like the NFL is not going to have like guidelines, you know what I mean, to like mimic.
I was going to ask you this. Do you think, because there's a lot of reason to maybe be more pessimistic about basketball right now, and I think baseball is probably going to try and do something. If you had to pick one of those two leagues to start, and only baseball. One of them will, it's baseball, right?
Yeah, like baseball. To me, and like, again, I don't want to risk getting political on any of this, but if you look at the composition of the fan bases, basketball is a more, like, you look at all the 538, basketball is a little more liberal fan base, right? So my guess is, given the way that the right and left have split on opening the economy, on all that kind of stuff, football fans are not going to be particularly sympathetic to players not playing. I think baseball is similar, a little bit more to the left, but I still think baseball fans are not going to be sympathetic at some level to players holding out for more money, whether that's right or wrong. And then I think basketball fans are going to be the most sympathetic, but I don't know if they're going to be sympathetic enough to tolerate. I mean, tolerate not restarting the season at any point.
To me, there's a big difference in. So we had this conversation. I thought it was really interesting, and I asked you. I was like, if you were an NFL player right now, would you go back? And both of us are in the same spot where it's like, yeah, I would absolutely go back and play. And to me, the difference between the Major League Baseball situation and the NFL situation is NFL players, to me, are going to be way more, let's get out there and play. Like, let's do what we've got to do to be able to play here. And a lot of that stems from, I think, just in baseball, like, what is a year? Like, what, like in the NFL, every year is like the difference between the beginning and the end of a career in some cases, right? In 100%. Baseball, that's just not the case. So those two factors would make me bullish on things happening, especially if baseball, because the rosters are bigger. And that's why I think baseball opening up is more important to showing a way for the NFL than basketball is, because the size of the rosters is what concerns me. You have that many players, And then what happens if a substantial component of that gets sick? And that's the part that worries me. Like, are they going to have thought through enough? What happens if 10 Tampa Bay Buccaneers get hurt or get injured?
Yeah. And there's not a lot of precedence for this, but we have seen it historically, things like MRSA happen. We've seen, and again, those are somewhat like, that's kind of an infectious, contagious thing in a sense, not from person to person, but from like facility to person. But again, yeah, this is unprecedented. My thought process is that, the NFL needs to find out a contingency plan, whether that be to add 10 players to every roster, whether that be and if you think about that from the player's perspective, you got to think about risk and reward. All these team members are young. Most of them, it's not like the coaches, frankly. The coaches are maybe health-wise the ones to be worried about. Players are all, young, healthy. And if you say to them, look, like the only players for which not having a season would be the better incentive would be players who are established. Because if you look at players who aren't established, you're saying, look, our rosters are going to be 60 players this year. That means you're going to have an opportunity to be on a roster. You're going to be on the active 50. Let's say they change it to 50 or 52 or something like that. You're going to have a chance to make some plays. Like that's going to provide an incentive for young players that I think is going to overcome a lot of people's worry about getting sick with COVID-19 specifically. Now, again, the morals of that notwithstanding, that's probably how it's going to play out. The real question, and I wonder, your thoughts on college football to me is a way more up in the air. But for the NFL, there's enough of an incentive structure, I think, to be able to provide everybody with the season. And we've already seen, like, people watch the replacement games when they played them in 1987. People, were the Major League Baseball had to come back from an enormous public relations nightmare when they struck in 94 and didn't finish the season. Like, and again, this isn't the same, but it's a similar thing where I think that they must feel some heat for, like, okay, we could lose a significant amount of fans if we let this thing go for, a whole year and a half without playing a game.
I don't know about college, man. We talked about which conferences would open up, and like, are we just watching SEC football? Are we just watching SEC and the ACC? Does the Big 12 join in? The Pac-12 seems like it would be in real peril if it was, like, hey, your state has to open up because California is on the side of being far, far more conservative than those southern states have been. So that worries me. I also wonder what happens if certain schools can't play. What happens to those players on that team? Are they given a chance to transfer? Are they given a year of eligibility so, like, they can go, into the NFL if they want? There's so many things that are interesting there. I have a hard time, though, imagining a conference like the SEC, which is about as close to, like, hey, these games matter just so much from a monetary perspective, doesn't find a way to play some games.
Yeah, the only thing that, and again, it makes a lot less sense for colleges. That being said, like, a lot of these colleges, especially in the South, if they don't have athletics, there's not a whole lot. Like, if you look at the SEC, the only SEC school that's any good academically is Vanderbilt. And so, the issue is going to be, like, where does your cash come from? But again, like, the hard part about the college football thing is you wonder, like, oh, this is going to be a public relations nightmare. This is going to be, and the NCAA is, like, littered with public relations nightmares. And they don't seem to care, so we'll see what ends up happening. We are still only in May. But some of these decisions I think have to be made relatively soon. I'm optimistic that we'll get an NFL season and at least some college football. But I'm very interested to see what happens over the next, weeks to months here. And we could even get spring football. I mean, there's like a, harebrained conspiracy theory that the XFL decided to fold shop because there's a significant chance that they would have to have competed with the Pac-12, right? If the Pac-12 plays in the spring, Big Ten plays in the spring, like, you know, at the end of the day, how bad is that?
Well, it's bad because the NFL draft will be happening.
Correct. I mean, it's not great, but we have seen leagues before, though. I mean, when you look at
True.
when you look at how, like, I think the WNBA, like, when you have where the pro season is not the same as the college season, there's like an interesting, like, for example, we have women's basketball players, they finish their season in like April, right? And then the WNBA starts in May, Yep. And so there is precedent for like how that, like, sort of staggeredness happens, but not in football for sure.
We'll transition here, but there was a tweet that popped up that was, you can only keep one of the Chiefs' offensive weapons. Who are you keeping? And the options were Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, Sammy Watkins, or Damian Williams. Which I thought was pretty funny.
The answer is clearly Hill, but is Kelce, if Kelce was 3 years younger, what would be the answer?
I was going to say, I'm not sure is it clearly Hill, given there's a lot more question marks with Hill? And that he's way more susceptible, like any little injury probably hurts him way more than it hurts Kelce.
If Hill was squeaky clean off the field, the answer would be Hill. If Kelce was 5 years younger, I think, and given all of Hill's question marks, it'd be Kelce. Kelce's 30 now. And yeah, as a Chiefs fan, I hope he's great for a long time. I do think the Chiefs have to consider contingencies there, where at wide receiver, it's pretty clearly, Hill's the guy there. As great as Sammy Watkins was in the playoffs and against Jacksonville week 1.
All right, let's do this because we spent a lot of time on The Last Dance. So let's do a little Josh Allen, and I want to pose a thought here, and I'm guessing this is something that Bills fans have thought of a little bit with Josh. Okay, so Josh Allen is, it turns out, despite his strong arm, well below league average throwing the ball 20 plus yards downfield. Using our accuracy charting, and I have to stare at this closely, he was about 21% below average in terms of throws that were accurate using our ball charting location. So, like, that's significant on throws 20 plus yards downfield. But that's something that is also unstable from season to season, and especially relative to throws in the intermediate range, where last season he was about 6.5% above average in terms of his accuracy using our ball location charting. And I'm wondering, maybe there's a little bit of, okay, he had John Brown and Cole Beasley last year. He's got Stephon Diggs this year. Let's see if having some guys that are maybe a little more confidence-inspiring downfield, he gets on the right side of variance there. And what we really need to be focusing on is that he has improved his accuracy in the intermediate range.
No, it's a really good point. I mean, when I look at this holistically, though, I think to myself, like, because these things, the splits are funny, right? Splits happen. When you look at him from an accuracy perspective, it's not just 20 and above, right? It's like 16 and above, 15 and above, and I wonder to my, like, yes, if you look at one sliver of his data, he looks okay. But ultimately speaking, like, if a team doesn't need to keep a top on its defense, like if a team can just like play you underneath, are you really going to be effective offensively? And there's a lot of stuff that the Bills did that were noisy positively. Allen had 6 rushing touchdowns on like 60 or so like designed runs. He fumbled 5 times, lost only 2 on those designed runs. He fumbled 14 times, lost only 4 on the other ones. He was like top 4 in the league on EPA per dropback that didn't result in a pass. But there's only one quarterback in the league where that's a positive number. For Allen, it's like a half a point per negative per. So like you look at the totality, you're like, okay, if they can, if he can catch the right side of variance on deep balls, if he can maintain his efficiency underneath and continue to provide rushing value, then we'll have a pretty good quarterback. All while jumping off from like the 22nd best team in the league in terms of EPA, or 24th, I think, in terms of full offensive. It's like, I don't know, man. To me, it's like you're asking so much to go right, and then your jumping off point isn't particularly good. It's different than, say, the 49ers, who are a great offense. And yes, you need a bunch of things to go right to continue to be great. You need a ton of things to be able to go right in Buffalo just to be good. It should be above average.
Well, the thing go ahead.
And I just, to me, I think the accuracy issues, like he puts a cap on his accuracy, right? He puts a cap on his accuracy because 26% of his passes are uncatchable inaccurate. That means that his completion percentage can only be 74% at most.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, they had some drops, and yes, but Diggs is not exactly the most sure-handed guy in the world. I mean, he's a great receiver, but dropped a lot of passes last year for the Vikings. And offensive line played well last year. Do they play as well this year? Do they have leads the way that they had? I mean, everybody talks about his fourth quarter comebacks. His fourth quarter comebacks were against Cincinnati, the New York Jets, when Darnold was like, spleen was 1.5 times its normal size. And I think it was like Tennessee. His comeback wins were against some bad team, like the Mariota, Tennessee.
No, you're spot on there. And the data point that I was going to bring up that you mentioned is he led the NFL in percentage of throws that were deemed uncatchable. And it's one thing to be accurate. It's another thing to not be inaccurate. And not being inaccurate, avoiding uncatchable throws, is the stable thing. It's the thing that points to sustainable accuracy. And what worries me about this is you can't have it both ways. So you can't go, you know what, we're going to take his average depth of target. We're going to decrease it by like 2 yards, which is what they did, right? They threw a ton more short passes. And that's going to inflate his accuracy numbers. And we're going to talk about how they've improved this year. Okay, if you want to do that, then you've also got to look at the things that aren't so rosy, which is he led the league in percentage of throws that were not catchable. And that's with him throwing fewer of the passes that he supposedly isn't very good at. Yeah. It's pervasive at the 0 to 9 yard. It's pervasive at the 10 to 19, and of course the 20+ yard range. And that's the thing that would worry me quite a bit. If you're trying to project Allen forward, there are definitely things there, and we've talked about this, that are very different from the Trubisky thing. But there are also things from a performance perspective that are very similar. And so you should at least be cautious. Even if you want to be a supporter, definitely be cautious. Let's talk a little surprise playoff contenders, because you wrote a great article. It's up on the site that you can go check out on pff.com. And we'll do this kind of quickly. What are some teams, I'll let you go first, that in the 2020 NFL season you think, you know what, there's not a ton of steam right now, but like if we're sitting there and they're a playoff team, this narrative makes sense?
I mean, for me, it's like it's fade the AFC East, right? You look at Dolphins, you look at the Jets. Those are two teams that people think, they don't have a snowball's chance in hell of making the playoffs, but both around plus 400. And that's an awful lot of confidence to bestow upon a division that includes Josh Allen and a Bills team that has made the playoffs twice this century. And New England, who's starting a new quarterback. New England has a question mark at the quarterback position for the first time since 1993. Mm-hmm. So, I'm not saying that but at the prices they're being given, there's what percent chance would you put Sam Darnold being the best quarterback in the division by his season's end? Base rate is 25%.
I would go 37 to 40. Because who is he competing with here? He's competing against Josh Allen, who I obviously feel like he has the upper hand on, and then basically Tua.
Yeah, I would put it at like a third.
You're less bullish on him.
No, I mean, I'm more bullish on him than the base rate, but I think there's people have already written Darnold off, and I get it. I understand the statistics and the probabilities that, if you struggle at that age, it's really hard to get out of that basin. But there's probably a 1/3, maybe 40% chance that Sam Darnold's the best quarterback in the division by season's end.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the case, then the Jets are far better than plus 350, plus 400 to win a division. And I think the same thing's true if you look at, and the Jets were 5th last year in yards per play allowed defensively. You look at that team, to me, is a playoff contender, and no one knows it yet. And they don't realize. If you ask somebody what the Jets' record was last year, no one's going to say 7-9.
Right.
Everybody remembers them getting
4-12.
blown out a bunch of times. Everybody remembers them. Sam Darnold seeing ghosts on Thursday or Monday Night Football. They were 7-9. They lost to the Dolphins. Like they weren't a great team, but they still were able to squeak out games because they have some decent components. And I think the Dolphins too. Like the floor for the Dolphins quarterback position is pretty high, because if Ryan Fitzpatrick plays horribly, they're going to put Tua in.
Mm-hmm.
And if Tua's not ready, they're going to put Fitzpatrick or Rosen in. And, all those quarterbacks have fault, but like the union of one of those 3 quarterbacks is probably going to be okay enough to compete in this division.
All right, let me give you mine that you mentioned here, and that's our plus 650, the Bengals. And this is another AFC team. And I would say if you're picking surprise teams to make the playoffs, the AFC makes a ton of sense, because the AFC has a couple of really good teams, and it's like, I don't know. And we talked about the Ravens regressing a little bit. There are also it feels like there's a lot of discontinuity with the Bengals, but there's a lot of discontinuity with the other 2 teams in that division, not named the Ravens, right? Ben Roethlisberger's coming back. He didn't play with those guys last year. And then Stefanski in Cleveland, like there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve there. So with a team that now, if Joe Burrow is a top 10 quarterback, and they're also getting Jonah Williams back, and they've also got T. Higgins to go along with a healthy A.J. Green, to me, plus 650, that's them squeaking in as a wild card just feels like the type of thing that would happen during this season. And then they get blown out, but they at least squeak in.
Yeah, and there's 7 playoff teams now. So
exactly.
I know that that's built into the price, but I do think people might be under handicapping the weirdness, right? Of that 7. Like the Steelers without Big Ben for 14 games would have made the playoffs last year.
Yep.
There's just such randomness. Like that team that gets that playoff spot may very well not be any good. And the Bengals can certainly fit that bill.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's the other thing is every time teams play the Bengals, they're going to want to beat them because of Joe Burrow, but it's also going to be like, it's the Bengals. Like this is the team we're least worried about and have been the least worried about for a really long time. The Jets have a little bit of considering Joe Burrow's just been quarantining at home with like his parents. So if you look at like all of the potential for, getting coronavirus and getting sick, I think like Joe Burrow is one of the safest people.
Plus Ohio's been fairly good at everything.
True.
To our hometown's credit.
All right, let's close out with this. We have a couple things that we'll save normalization for another time.
We talk too much, and the off season's long. Let's push that back.
There's plenty of time.
Yeah.
But we got a good question in from at JER Siegs. I'm definitely pronouncing that terribly, but his question boiled down to, so Aaron Donald is the best defensive player in the NFL, but is he the most valuable? We talk a lot about how coverage is more valuable than pass rush, but Donald's been the best interior pass rusher by a wide margin for years. Is there a surety you get with Donald more valuable than the best cornerback in the game who isn't as far ahead of everyone else at his position like Gilmore? And so this is a great question. If you're looking at next year, who do you think is the most valuable player in the NFL or on the defense side of the ball?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, here's the thing. What I do know is oh man, it's a great question, because you think about it's akin to some of these simulations that we've had. Like, what team is going to win 13 games? Well, none of these simulations are going to spit out 13 as an average. And it's sort of the same thing. It's sort of the same thing as saying, like, okay, who's going to be more valuable than Donald? I know Donald is going to be within a certain band of war, right? That's going to be kind of higher than if I project any of these corners. But I know that there's going to be a cornerback who who hits on like this sort of low probability event and becomes like an almost like a 0.8 player, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and the hard part is generally speaking, like those players are hard to predict, which is kind of making the argument again of value in a season may not necessarily be value overall.
Yep.
A great question. Okay, so let's actually answer your question.
So I asked it that way for that exact reason, which is if you're only there for one season, then you've got to consider the chances of, look, if I'm taking something that's unstable, then I've got to consider the lack of stability. But if I am picking value based on over time, so say the next 5 years, then that's where you have more opportunity for coverage to become more valuable. And so that's where I would then lean.
Yeah, but you do get some evening out though too, which is sort of strange, right? Because Sherman, for example, was the highest cover grade last year during the regular season, but in 2018 he wasn't great, and in 2017 he was hurt a lot. So like the average of those 3 years, I think Donald might have him in terms of WAR. I actually have to look.
Yeah, but Sherman's a unique, a little bit of a unique case because you wouldn't take a guy that old.
Yeah, I still think the best bet. So like, let's think for a second. The best bet is probably, and this is going to sound silly to some people, I think the best bet is Casey Hayward of the Los Angeles Chargers, because he's somebody who was in the ballpark of most valuable corner for a couple of years, regressed a tiny bit once, and then kind of came back. He's been like pretty stable season to season as being very valuable. Gilmore's kind of been up and down. We're not quite sure. Like, let's say the Patriots stink and other teams are not throwing the ball in desperation against the Patriots. Does he have as many interceptions? Does he have as many pass breakups? Whereas I think the Chargers have like exhausted the space of possibilities the last few years. Like they went 0-4, then almost won the AFC West in 2017. They went 12-4 in 2018. They were terrible last year. And like Casey Hayward's kind of been impervious to all that and been very valuable the whole time. And so like, I don't think he's coming off of like the tail season for him. So maybe, to me, that might be the best bet.
Casey Hayward's a good one. I also thought of Jalen Ramsey as being somebody who.
Here's a question about Ramsey though: is he hasn't signed a deal yet?
Right. Is he playing?
I mean,
pending he plays.
And I was on our friend Evan Silva's podcast with Adam Leviton the other day, and I talked. The Rams, I think, are a team that I don't think I can fade enough this year.
It makes sense.
Change the subject just a tad. I mean, their season win total to be 9.5 early on in the process seems so quaint. And I think if they finish with a season win total above 8 by the time the season opens, I'd be surprised.
No, I agree with you wholeheartedly on the Rams. I'm thinking about a guy who, because of the situation last year, certainly did not play his best football. And if he's playing anywhere near his best football, is the guy who I would take first as a corner, if I'm building a team around. So like that team could play poorly record-wise, and he could still be at the top of his game and have one of those seasons, now that he's kind of got a little bit more stability there. But this is a really interesting question, and it points to, all the things about why it's important to be both valuable, and stable at the same time. You're not going to get that, though, that often, and particularly on the defensive side of the ball where coverage is so susceptible to the offenses that you're playing, right? Like it just is. So I don't know. So you go Hayward though, if you had to choose one.
Yeah.
That says a lot, right? Like it just tells you how.
I almost said Marcus Peters, but I sort of am still pissed the Chiefs traded him. So.
Okay. You're not going to go Damian Williams though.
No, Damian's like, dude, think about that. The Super Bowl elicited 2 players who like are generally bad, who are going to be legends in Kansas City, Sammy Watkins and Damian Williams.
Oh, man, I still think it's funny that Sammy Watkins was traded up for, and that when we were rewatching that draft, that Ray Lewis was like waxing poetic about how he was the best player in the draft.
Well, it was sort of the interesting, like Clemson wide receiver. Like it was we made fun of like the Florida corners or whatever, and it was like, they had Hopkins, and then they had Watkins, and then they had Williams, and for a while there it was sort of like a wide, Renfro. They had the wide receiver and it's like, yeah, maybe like just go past the jersey color when you evaluate talent. Although Watkins has had broken feet, he's had issues with injuries, but and he generally has played well in offenses where he had to be. I mean, he had a 1,000-yard season with Tyrod Taylor, but yeah, the trading up for him. Maybe here's the last question of the day. Did you think the Julio Jones trade was a good trade?
No.
Right. So but people will forever say that was successful because it worked. It ended up working out.
Well, they have 0 Super Bowls.
Right.
The best
but they got a Hall of Fame player. That's a trophy.
Using the Super Bowls argument to like say that the trade was bad, even though the trade was bad for like a totally different reason. I think that's funny. The Julio thing is tough, right? Because it's like people have such a hard time divorcing the process from the result. I was going to say, I have one more question for you that I just thought of right now. I don't know why, but you were talking about the quarterbacks for the AFC East. And I was thinking about the NFC East. If you look at, so obviously Wentz and Prescott are one side of the thing. Haskins and Jones, percentage chance, how you would distribute the chances of those guys being better versus the other.
Yeah, I would say I would put Prescott or Wentz at 75%.
Okay, but how would you? I'm saying
and then
between Jones and Haskins,
and I would split the last. So I would say Jones. I
think it's really close too.
I think it's even. I honestly, like, Haskins had some bad statistics last year, but I ultimately felt as though he had less to work with. I thought Gruden was not great at the end. His receivers,
McLaurin, though.
He had only one receiver. Yeah, but you look okay, Pat Shurmur is a good coach. The Giants were like top 15 in yards per play in 2018 with Eli Manning. They were top 2/3 of the league last year with Daniel Jones and Eli Manning. You had Barkley for some of the year. You had Slayton, you had Shepard, and you had Ingram. The offensive line wasn't great, but I thought Jones had more to work with, and so I'll put it even. And to me, the being even is more of a say on. I think I'm a little bit bullish on Haskins after. I think the public will say Haskins was bad last year compared to Jones.
Oh, certainly. I think if you did a poll right now, people would think that it's Jones.
Well, let's do the PFF Forecast poll.
Here's what I would say about the two of them. So let me make sure I get this right here. So Daniel Jones, I almost called him Daniel Jeremiah there, which is kind of funny.
I almost channeled my inner Neil and said Jones.
Daniel Jones so he had 12 interceptions, but nearly 6% of his dropbacks were turnover-worthy plays. Like that. So like to put that in context here, there were 35 quarterbacks that we consider, in the sample. There were only 2 of them that had a higher rate of turnover-worthy plays than Daniel Jones.
Yeah.
Like that's a little scary to me. Whereas Dwayne Haskins, like at least I know with Haskins, like I think there's going to be less of a chance of a total breakout.
Mm-hmm.
But his average is a little higher.
Here's what I think it is. Giants fans have had the same quarterback since 2004. In that time period, if you would have thrown for 3,000 yards on 62% completion with 2-to-1 touchdown interception ratio, you'd be considered good. And in that time, so like I have one of my good friends is a Giants fan. He's like, Eli should be in the Hall of Fame. Look at all his numbers. I'm like, yeah, 30 touchdown passes was amazing in 2003. it's like kind of average right now, not average, but it's kind of like a reasonable outcome if you're behind all the time in 2020. So like, but Giants fans see his like raw numbers and they're like, wow, this quarterback would have been great because they've only had like relatively few guys play the position during that time period. The other thing that's funny when you look at Jones, he had 24 touchdowns last year. 13 of them came in 3 games. He had 4 against Detroit, which they lost that game. And he had 4 against the Jets, and they lost that game because he fumbled 3 times. And then he had 5 against Washington, who's, not, as we just talked about, not a very good team. And in fact, they had to win that game in overtime. So, I think there's a lot of bias over, in close losses / one, overtime win, Daniel Jones was gutsy and got stuff done. Right. And, ultimately we look at that and was like, well, how stable is that though? Because, when I look at the first Washington game, the Minnesota game, the New England game, the Arizona game, he looks bad, and as you said, turnover worthy plays were bountiful for him, as a percentage of his dropbacks. So
I thought this was interesting too, looking at just like the grading by week. And like Haskins came in and it was like a disaster, right? Like an absolute disaster. Like, didn't he come in against the Giants, right? Was that the first game he played? Yes. An absolute travesty. But his first 3 games were really, really, really bad. And then things stabilized. He had 2 games where there were 2 weeks where he was the top 5 graded quarterback, eclipsed an 80 PFF grade. Daniel Jones didn't have a single game where he graded above 80. So like the idea that Daniel Jones has this like super high ceiling relative to Dwayne Haskins is a little mischaracterized. That being said, Dwayne Haskins overall, a lot of negatively graded throws, was not, an accurate throw of the football last year.
Yeah. A lot of bad there too. And that's the thing, is they're sort of, projecting, but he certainly did finish well. I mean, he got hurt, I think, right in the overtime game, against the Giants in week, 16, but he threw 2 touchdowns, no picks, 80%, completed 80% of his passes. I mean, he had some good performances. If you throw out his like relief appearance, his first 2 relief appearances, the New York Giants game, and then that weird Thursday night game where the Vikings sort of like sleptwalk and beat them by 10, you look at his touchdown to interception ratio changes from 7 to 7 to 7 to 3. And, his completion percentage is probably above 60. If you look at that. So it's always, again, like we play these games with small samples. Where do we sort of round this out? Well, who is better in college? Well, Haskins was better in college than Jones was. So like fold that data in. And I think it's a little bit more of an even Steven sort of debate here, which is not what Twitter thinks. Twitter.
I would go so far as to say, if I had to choose one, I would take Dwayne Haskins. I believe that Broncos fans would be infuriated that Drew Lock was not taken over both of them.
Yeah.
And I think you could make a case that Gardner Minshew should be up there as well. So it's an interesting conversation.
Gardner Minshew had more yards as a scrambler last season than Josh Allen, which blew my mind, but it happened.
Wow. That's good. That's incredible. Really?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Minshew was the most valuable rookie in the NFL a season ago. I know we're all encouraged by Murray, but I think Minshew was better than him. And, not to say that that's going to happen long-term. But as far as, wins per dollar, Gardner Minshew was like one of the better draft picks we've seen in quite some time last year.
That's why you take quarterbacks late. All right. Reminder that if you leave us a 5-star review with a good question or take or anything, even a joke, look, we could all use it. Hey, leave your favorite recipe, your favorite drink, whatever. If we choose to read it, we'll get you either a free subscription or some PFF swag. So we read your question at JERSIEGS. So shoot either of us a DM, or I'll find you and shoot you a DM, and we'll get you set up. But hit us up for next week. We got to find a guest for Thursday. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll figure it out. Anyways, Thanks guys for tuning in, and we'll talk to you guys on Thursday. Peace out.